A witness heard David Pearce say 3 words after 2 women were dying in his apartment. Dead girls don't talk. He carried their bodies out himself, dumped one at a hospital, left the other one on a sidewalk, put on a mask so nobody could recognize him, then went home. I want to start somewhere most videos about this case don't start. Not with the crime, not with the party, not with David Pearce. With Christy and Hilda, because these 2 women get reduced to victims in almost every headline about this case, and I refuse to do that. Christy Giles was 24 years old, a model, an aspiring actress. She had moved to Los Angeles with a dream, the same dream a million people carry to that city and most never see come true. She had a husband, Jan Cilliers, a man who loved her so completely that after she died, he scattered half her ashes in every place they had loved together. And her mother took the other half, wrapped them in the wedding dress Christy never got to wear, and kept them close. Read that again. The wedding dress she never got to wear. Christy was 24. She had her whole life in front of her, and someone took it from her in one night. Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola was 26, an architect. She had moved from Mexico to Los Angeles with a mind sharp enough and ambitions big enough to build a real future there. Her friends described her as intelligent, funny, happy to be alive. She had a dog named Tomas. When she died, her boyfriend Alan took the dog. He said Tomas became his emotional fortress. That he would be very lost without him. Think about what that means. A man is rebuilding his life after losing the woman he loved, and the thing holding him together is the dog she left behind. And on the night of November 12th, 2021, they went to a warehouse party in East Los Angeles. Together. Best friends having a night out. Doing exactly what 2 young women in their 20s are supposed to be able to do safely. They never came home. Now let me tell you about David Pearce, because understanding who he was before that night is the only way to understand how this happened. Pearce described himself as a Hollywood producer. He was 39 years old. He lived in Beverly Hills. He moved in social circles that gave him access to parties, events, creative people. The kind of environment where a young model and her friend at a warehouse party might not think twice about leaving with him. That access was not an accident. That was the whole system. A former prosecutor who analyzed this case described him perfectly. She said, at best, he was a con man. At worst, a criminal, a sexual predator, a drug dealer, and ultimately a murderer. Here is what I need you to sit with before we go any further. David Pearce had been doing this since 2005. 16 years before Christy and Hilda died, he had already started. 7 confirmed victims came forward at trial. 7 women who testified to what he had done to them between 2007 and 2021. And those are just the ones who survived. The ones who remembered enough. The ones brave enough to walk into a courtroom and say his name out loud. 16 years, 7 women, and nobody stopped him. His method never changed because it didn't need to. He would meet women at social events, offer them something that looked like cocaine. What he was actually giving them was GHB, a drug that leaves your body fast and makes your memory unreliable, combined with fentanyl, one of the most lethal substances on Earth. He was not careless. He was not reckless. He chose those specific drugs because they did exactly what he needed them to do. They incapacitated women quickly. They left little trace, and they made victims doubt themselves. The judge at his sentencing called him the worst kind of criminal. She said victims had used the words con artist, manipulator, and wolf to describe him. She looked at him directly and said, all of them apply to you. She was being generous. 3 a.m., November 13th, 2021. A warehouse party in East Los Angeles. Christy and Hilda were there. They were having a good night. At some point, Hilda texted Christy asking if she wanted cocaine. Christy said yes. Surveillance footage captured Christy and Hilda leaving the party with David Pearce, his roommate Brant Osborne, and a photographer named Michael Ansbach. 5 people getting into a car at 3 a.m. Nothing unusual about that from the outside. At 5:11 a.m., the car pulled up outside Pearce's Beverly Hills apartment. Now, here's the moment I want you to think about. 35 minutes after walking through that door, just 35 minutes, Hilda tried to call a rideshare to leave. Think about what that means. Her body was already telling her something was wrong. Some part of her brain, fighting through whatever was happening to her, said, "I need to get out of here." She grabbed her phone. She actually called for a car. She never made it out. Neither she nor Christy left that apartment for 11 hours. 11 hours. I want you to imagine being someone who loves one of these women, a husband, a boyfriend, a friend. You know they went to a party, you know they left with some people, and then hours pass, then more hours, and their phones go quiet. 11 hours those women were inside that apartment in serious medical distress. And David Pearce was right there. What he did at the end of those 11 hours is the detail that tells you exactly who David Pearce is. He carried Christy's body out of the apartment himself, put her in a car, drove to Southern California Hospital in Culver City, left her outside. She was already dead when she arrived. Then he went back, got Hilda, who was still alive, still breathing, still lighting, and drove her to Kaiser Permanente, West Los Angeles, left her on the sidewalk. Both he and Osborne were wearing masks. Not for health reasons, not for anonymity in a crowd, masks specifically so nobody could identify their faces, because they knew exactly what they had done and they were calculating every move to make sure it couldn't be traced back to them. Hilda was resuscitated at the hospital. Her family had 11 days of hope. She died on November 27th, one day before her 27th birthday. One day. And then there are 3 words. The 3 words that Michael Ansbach, who was in that apartment, heard David Pearce say while those women were dying. Dead girls don't talk. He believed that. He had believed it for 16 years, and he had been right, until now. The investigation started at the hospitals. When Christy's body was dropped at Southern California Hospital, and Hilda was abandoned at Kaiser, both in the early morning hours, both left by people who immediately disappeared, investigators knew instantly this was not an accident. Normal people do not drop unconscious or dying women at hospital entrances and run. Normal people do not wear masks while doing it. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from the warehouse party. They got the images they needed. Christy and Hilda leaving with Pearce, Osborne, and Ansbach. They had their suspects. Now they needed their evidence. The break came from something Pearce apparently forgot about. His black Prius, registered in his name, parked right behind his building, matching the car seen at both hospitals. Same model, same black rims. Detectives went to his apartment, knocked on the door. The lights went out immediately. Complete silence. For 15 minutes, there was nothing. Then finally, Pearce and Osborne opened the door. Pearce looked at the detective and denied owning a Prius. His Prius was parked right outside. He was arrested, not yet for the murders, but for 4 separate sexual assault charges that were already on file. Let that sink in. There were already charges against this man. A pattern was already documented, and he had remained free long enough to meet Christy and Hilda at a party and do what he had been doing for 16 years. When his name became public, the 7 other women came forward. Women who had been carrying what he did to them alone, some for years, some for over a decade. Women whose memories had been made unreliable by the same drugs he used on Christy and Hilda. Women who had questioned themselves, who had wondered if anyone would believe them. They came forward anyway. Every single one. The trial started in early 2025, and the moment that defined it was not the toxicology reports. It was not the surveillance footage. It was not the expert testimony about how fentanyl kills. It was 7 women walking into a courtroom and talking, one by one, describing what David Pearce had done to them between 2007 and 2021. 14 years of crimes that nobody had been able to stop because the drugs he used made memory unreliable and silence feels safer than speaking. They were not silent anymore. 3 counts of forcible rape, 2 counts of sexual penetration by force, 1 count of sodomy by force, 1 count of raping an unconscious woman. 9 separate crimes against 7 different women across 14 years. The defense tried to argue that everyone at the apartment that night got sick, that Ansbach also felt the effects of the drugs, and that 2 people dying while others survived meant it wasn't intentional murder. The defense attorney even admitted after the trial that his own client's decision to take the stand didn't help him. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. Guilty on both murders. Guilty on all 7 sexual assault charges. Guilty on every single count. The detective who led the investigation said he didn't breathe until he heard guilty on the last charge. Christy's mother, Dusty, stood outside the courthouse and said she was proud. And then she said something that I keep thinking about. She said the Jane Does, the 7 women who testified, had finally had their day in court, and they were believed. Do you understand how powerful that is? These women had spent years not being believed, by themselves, by circumstances, by a system that makes it almost impossible to prosecute drug-facilitated assault. And in that courtroom, in front of a jury, they were believed. That is what took David Pearce down. Not surveillance footage, not a confession. 7 women who refused to stay quiet. October 2025, David Pearce stood in front of Judge Eleanor Hunter. She called him the worst kind of criminal. She ran through every word victims had used to describe him: con artist, manipulator, wolf. She said all of them apply to you, and then she sentenced him to 146 years to life in prison, plus lifetime sex offender registration. He is never getting out. But here is what I need to tell you before we close this out. Brant Osborne, Pearce's roommate, the man who was in that apartment, the man who drove the car to both hospitals, the man who helped carry those women out and leave them like they were nothing, the man who wore a mask to hide his face while doing it. Because the story is not finished. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict on his charges. He is awaiting a new trial. The man who helped, the man who knew, the man who looked at 2 dying women and helped his roommate dispose of them, has not been convicted of anything in connection with their deaths. That case is still open. And Hilda's mother said something at sentencing that I think about. She said there will always be a hole, that nothing can fill it, but that Hilda loved to live, and the way to honor her is to keep living. Christy's mother wrapped her daughter's ashes in a wedding dress. Those are the 2 images that stay with me from this entire case, not David Pearce, not the courtroom. A mother wrapping her daughter's remains in a dress she never got to wear. Christy's mother wrapped her daughter's ashes in a wedding dress. Those are the 2 images that stay with me from this entire case. Not David Pearce, not the courtroom. A mother wrapping her daughter's remains in a dress she never got to wear. David Pearce operated for 16 years because he understood something true and ugly about the world. Drug-facilitated assault is almost impossible to prosecute. Memory gaps make victims easy to doubt. A charming man in creative circles is easy to believe. And women who aren't sure exactly what happened to them often stay quiet because the alternative, being disbelieved, feels worse. He had calculated all of that. He had built an entire system around it. He called it insurance. He said dead girls don't talk. What he forgot is that the women he left alive, the ones who survived him, were not dead. And they had 16 years of silence to make up for. 7 women walked into that courtroom and made sure Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola did not die without consequence. 146 years. David Pearce is not talking to anyone either. Leave your thoughts below. Subscribe to Criminal Files. Every case has a side the world never heard.